These are soldiers from two of the world's largest and most expensive militaries. They're beating each other with fists, clubs, and rocks.
Literally hand-to-hand combat.
Videos like these have been watched millions of times around the world. So why are China and India fighting like this? And do these viral videos signal a much deadlier conflict in the future?
Think Ukraine versus Russia multiplied 50 times.
India and China, two nuclear powers that between them are home to almost a third of the world's population. They're separated by about 2,100 miles of inhospitable Himalayan mountains, but they've never been able to agree on where northern India starts and China's western regions end. And when patrolling soldiers cross paths, it can turn ugly.
This is not your bloody area.
This is not your area.
But these huge armies are not using advanced weapons here. That's because China and India have agreed no guns should be fired within the border region, known as the line of actual control. But this agreement is breaking down, and some experts now fear the worst.
These are military guys, facing off with each other. They have got weapons. Definitely there is a potential for escalation.
The land they're fighting over, it's mostly desolate mountain ranges. So why can't they come to an agreement? Because this argument goes back more than 70 years to the very beginning of the People's Republic of China and an independent India.
Another red crime against an unprepared nation.
Shortly after the Chinese Communist Party seized power in 1949, they invaded Tibet, which had effectively been an independent state in the early 20th century during years of political turmoil in China. Around the same time, India overthrew British rule and became a republic. Not for the first time, the departing colonial power left a mess at the border. The British had tried to establish some lines on a map which the new Indian Republic adopted. But China never accepted them, believing their claim stretched back centuries. Then in 1959, Beijing violently suppressed an uprising in Tibet, forcing the Dalai Lama, the unifying religious leader of Tibet, to flee to India, where he's since led a government in exile. China was furious with India, and some say they've never forgiven them.
The highest and coldest frontier in the world.
A few years later, China launched an invasion of the disputed borderlands. Thousands died in a short, bloody war which ended in a humiliating defeat for India. China expanded their control of an area in northwest India and occupied this region in the east. But within a month of the ceasefire, the Chinese withdrew and India re-established its hold, including Tawang, which has important links to Tibetan Buddhism. Ultimately, neither side was happy, and it's effectively been a frozen war ever since. There have been periods of relative calm though, where real progress towards peace was made, including an agreement in 1996 not to fire guns along the border. By 2012, an agreement on the border seemed close, which would have seen both sides recognise parts of the other's claim. But the deal was never signed. By then, China had a new leader, and 2 years later, so did India. Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi are two strongmen leaders who use nationalism to bolster their support at home. Early on, their relationship was good.
Till the end of 2019, it appeared that India and China had reset their relations and everything was going hunky-dory.
But under Xi, China has adopted a more aggressive stance on the international stage.
中国人民也绝不允许任何外来势力欺负、压迫、奴役我们。
Nothing is more important in Chinese foreign policy overall than essentially trying to match and in some ways overcome the global power of the United States.
And these ambitions for China have implications for India.
The Chinese now look at the Indians and they say, well, these guys, they've got to accept that we are the number one power in Asia.
However, Xi is wary of provoking a major international backlash.
China wants to try and avoid having any sort of conflict whatsoever in any area if it can gain its territorial demands or claims by other means.
So Xi has boosted investment in infrastructure along the border with India, bolstered China's military presence, and even built villages in disputed areas.
They are dual purpose villages where they can also be used for military purposes to launch a small attack, a small maneuver on an Indian post.
Seeing this, India has also been building infrastructure to allow troops and weapons to be rushed to the border in a crisis. And then in June 2020, this happened. After a series of standoffs and scuffles, Indian and Chinese troops clashed in the Galwan Valley. India says 20 soldiers, including a commanding officer, died. China says 4 of their soldiers were killed. They were the first deaths on the border for 45 years. Chinese media released this footage, glorifying their soldiers and portraying Indian troops as aggressors. There was a major backlash in India with a boycott of Chinese goods.
After this clash, both India and China have used arms. Since then, both sides are carrying weapons and using fire.
Galwan sparked more skirmishes along the border. But this isn't just a battle on the ground. Videos of these brawls are going viral, whipping up an online frenzy of nationalism. This footage is from 2021, but it was circulated in India after the latest clash in December 2022.
This was to kind of bolster the morale of the Indian people, to tell them that the Indian forces are standing up strongly up to China and even defeating them, beating them black and blue. It's essentially to protect the strongman image of Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
And it's working. A recent poll found a majority of Indians think their military can defeat China. And splitting that poll down political lines, Modi supporters are particularly confident. India is the 3rd largest military spender in the world, but their budget is dwarfed by China's, and India is largely outgunned by its neighbour. So Modi is looking for international partners to bolster India's position. India has recently been playing a more active role in a partnership with Japan, Australia, and the United States, known as the Quad. This includes holding joint military drills with the US right on the border with China. Even though China scathingly calls the Quad an Asian NATO, it's not a binding alliance that would force the other members to help India in a conflict. Instead of compromising, Xi is doubling down.
The Indian border issue is often characterized as mota, friction in Chinese. I think Beijing thinks it's probably a relatively safe bet to keep poking away at the mota, the friction that they have had for decades now on their border with India.
So, with no border deal on the horizon, it's likely that viral videos of brutal fights will continue to fly around the internet, stirring up nationalist hatred.
The kind of low-level burn, the simmer, which seems to mark the clashes between the two sides, is likely to be the reality for some time to come.
But as both countries strengthen their positions on the border, with armed soldiers who now have orders to use those guns, there's a genuine threat that events could spiral out of control.
Deterrence has completely broken down, and breakdown of that deterrence makes the situation very, very risky and very dangerous, particularly with 2 nuclear powers and with the kind of population and economy that these countries have. Think Ukraine versus Russia multiplied 50 times.